There once was a globally popular, boldly explicit American TV series. It pushed the limits in both violence and sensual scenes to the extreme. That series was Spartacus, worthy of a lifetime collection for drama fans. With his outstanding performance in the first season, the lead actor Andy Whitfield astonishingly rose to stardom. However, fate played a cruel trick. Shortly after the first season, Andy was diagnosed with advanced lymphoma, with doctors giving him only 3 to 6 months to live. Upon learning this, the TV network even specially arranged a 6-episode prequel to be filmed by another team, giving Andy time to recover and undergo treatment. Unfortunately, God was jealous. Andy, who conquered the Roman slave masters in the show, ultimately succumbed to his illness. In this situation, Liam McIntyre bravely stepped in to fill Andy's shoes. While retaining the rebellious spirit of Spartacus, he also presented a new Spartacus to the audience. The story picks up from the previous season. To win their freedom, Spartacus and his followers bloodily stormed the slave master's mansion and, with hundreds of slaves and gladiators, embarked on a path of escape. The target was too big and they had to hide in a sewer on the outskirts of the city to avoid the soldiers. The prolonged escape left them completely out of resources. Spartacus had no choice but to risk leading a few gladiators to hunt, only to encounter soldiers sent for their pursuit. Fortunately, as well-trained gladiators, dealing with a few Roman soldiers was not a challenge. After scavenging what they could use from the soldiers, Spartacus carved the name Glaber onto the bodies. This act was meant to lure Glaber out for Spartacus to avenge his deceased wife. Soon, Spartacus's challenge reached Rome. As the instigator of all this, Glaber, now in politics, also found himself in trouble. Albinius, holding a significant position, immediately confronted Glaber, demanding he resolve the mess he had created. After all, slaves killing dozens of nobles was unheard of in the class-defined society of the time, even shocking the whole of Rome. If Glaber failed to handle this appropriately, his future in the Senate would be bleak. Reluctantly, Glaber agreed to go to Capua to pursue Spartacus, but before that, he decided to bring his wife Ilithia along. Since he couldn't oppose Albinius, he chose to indirectly take revenge through his daughter. This was because Glaber knew his wife would never overcome her psychological trauma associated with that place. Meanwhile, the rebellion faced internal and external troubles. Though they appeared united as slaves fighting for freedom, in reality, they harbored differing motives and deep conflicts. The Gauls, making up more than half of the rebel forces, looked only to Crixus for leadership, unwilling to share their seized food with Spartacus's group. Fortunately, having experienced so much together, Crixus and Spartacus had developed a friendship, with Crixus attempting to persuade his men to follow Spartacus's command. However, Crixus often risked exposing their hideout to gather information about his lover Naetia. Spartacus also prioritized revenge, even going against his companion's wishes by carving Glaber's name into the corpses. Varro's wife, Aurelia, tired of the fugitive life, longed to return to her hometown to visit her 2 children. Thus, Spartacus handed over all his money to Aurelia, allowing her to leave Rome with her children for a peaceful life away from conflict. What they didn't know was that this parting would be a final farewell. By this time, Glaber had already arrived at Capua with his army. To Ilithia's utter disbelief, her husband Glaber chose Batiatus's former residence as their headquarters. Ilithia had witnessed the massacre there firsthand. As she was consumed by fear, a ghost-like figure suddenly appeared behind her. Hearing Ilithia's screams, Glaber rushed over. The figure was Lucretia, the sole survivor of the slaughter, looking disheveled and deranged. Knowing that Lucretia was aware of her sordid past, Ilithia quickly urged Glaber to eliminate her. However, Marcus, who accompanied them, intervened. Marcus informed Glaber that Lucretia was the sole survivor of the massacre. They could portray Lucretia as someone blessed by the gods. This would not only inspire the public but also use Lucretia to incite anger against Spartacus, aiding their search for his hideout. Glaber thought it made sense, so Lucretia survived. That evening, while arranging for Lucretia to wash up, Ilithia approached her to test whether she remembered the past events. After some questioning, Ilithia realized that Lucretia appeared to have lost her memory, easing her mind. Hearing of the Roman army's approach, those hiding in the sewer were terrified. Spartacus encouraged everyone to unite and fight against Rome. However, at that moment, Enomaus appeared, having also heard of Glaber leading the army. Spartacus invited Enomaus to join the rebellion, but he refused. Enomaus had a deep-rooted sense of honor as a gladiator, believing that a gladiator's duty was to die in the arena, and thus had no intention of joining the rebellion. His purpose was to inform his former brothers that Glaber would deliver a speech in the marketplace the next day, presenting an opportunity to escape. Spartacus, however, was not receptive to Enomaus' suggestion, obsessed with eliminating Glaber. Crixus and Mira both opposed Spartacus's approach, realizing that their current strength was no match for Glaber's forces. But Spartacus, blinded by hatred, remained steadfast in his views and disregarded advice. The next day, when Crixus was preparing to lead the slaves southward, Spartacus was nowhere to be seen. At that time, Spartacus was already blending in with the people of Capua, alone. Protected by a group of soldiers, Glaber used Lucretia's survival to stir up the public, portraying Spartacus as a cruel and despicable villain. Simultaneously, Glaber presented a severely injured woman, Varro's wife, Aurelia. She doesn't seem to have escaped the Romans. Seeing the pitiful state of Aurelia, Spartacus could no longer hold back. He drew his blade and charged at Glaber. In the ensuing chaos, Glaber was slightly wounded, but as the soldiers gathered, Spartacus was soon surrounded. Spartacus was about to be killed when Crixus descended from the sky with several gladiators. Despite Spartacus's foolish act, Crixus did not abandon his brother in arms.
Take Aurelia and go!
Then, in the crowd, Crixus caught sight of the surviving Lucretia. Their eyes met, and a flood of memories returned. It seemed Lucretia's amnesia was feigned. Spartacus still wanted to kill Glaber, but upon Crixus's repeated persuasion, he eventually retreated with the others. Back at their hideout, Mira and Crixus condemned Spartacus's reckless actions. They needed a leader, not a hot-headed youth. Even if Spartacus had killed Glaber, the Senate would have sent a large army in retaliation, and all of them would have perished because of his recklessness. During the argument, Agron interrupted them. Aurelia had requested to see Spartacus one last time. By then, Aurelia had regained consciousness. Her final wish, before dying, was for Spartacus to stay away from her son, as both Varro and she met their ends because of Spartacus. After saying this, Aurelia closed her eyes forever. Spartacus was overwhelmed with grief. He had sworn to protect Varro's wife and child, but now he was the cause of Aurelia's death, all because of his impulsiveness. At that moment, Spartacus finally realized the gravity of the situation and the heavy responsibility he bore.
Or fall, divided, a lesson hard learned. Shackle will be struck from every slave upon our path. We will see our numbers grow. And when they have become legion, we will face Glaber and the hordes of Rome again, and the gods shall weep for their suffering.
In ancient Rome, the fate of slaves was extremely grim. The majority of slaves were originally war captives, debtors, or criminals. Once branded with the red-hot iron of slavery, they were destined to be slaves for life, with no chance of turning their fortunes. Even their children would continue to serve as slaves, generation after generation, leading hopeless lives. Most of them were sent to mines to work for life, chained and treated like animals, living in perpetual darkness. A few physically strong slaves were trained as gladiators and sent to arenas to fight to the death, serving as entertainment and pleasure for the nobility. If you thought of escaping or spoke ill of your master, crucifixion and public display on the streets was your only fate. In such circumstances, a remarkable leader of a slave rebellion emerged. He was Spartacus, revered by later generations as a hero of the slaves. Since Spartacus's massacre at the slave master's training facility, he led dozens of slaves and gladiators southward, fleeing. Along the way, they assisted Crixus in searching for his lover, Naevia, and continued to massacre slave masters' estates, liberating slaves they encountered. Spartacus liberated all the slaves, reassuring them not to panic, as they were now free individuals, no longer bearing the status of slaves. He called on them to join his rebel army, but after long-term subjugation to slave mentality, despite their hatred for slave masters, who would dare to risk execution to rebel against their owners?
I am Spartacus.
Upon hearing Spartacus's name, the slaves were excited as if they had seen a deity. However, a mere glance from their master was enough to silence them. Bowing obediently, hearing he was the master of the place, Crixus immediately took him into a room for a violent interrogation. hoping to learn about Naidia's whereabouts. Unexpectedly, after Crixus described Naidia's situation, the slave master revealed that he had indeed seen her. It turns out that Batiatus, in order to become an administrator, sent Naidia to the estates of various slavers for them to enjoy in turn, in order to gain the support of the local slavers. As for Naidia's current location, he had no idea. Hearing this, Crixus, filled with rage, smashed the slave master's head to pieces. After this battle, the gladiators began to plunder the slave master's house for fine wine and food. They indulged recklessly, and some even started to mistreat the newly liberated female slaves. This caused Spartacus some worry. Without discipline, they might never become a formidable force. Agron had his concerns too. He believed the team needed capable warriors, but the newly liberated slaves lacked combat skills. Facing the pursuit of Roman soldiers, their continued presence could eventually drag down the entire group. But Spartacus's vision was grander. He pursued not just personal freedom, but the liberation of many more. He aspired to bring equality and freedom to all slaves in the world. Unfortunately, Spartacus didn't realize just how much the idea of slavery poisoned the slaves. One night, as Spartacus and Mira were preparing to be intimate, a newly liberated slave suddenly burst into the room, attempting to assassinate Spartacus. Mira questioned him. "Spartacus has no grudge against you and gave you your freedom. Why do you repay kindness with hostility and wish to kill him?" Tiberius replied that he found his previous life comfortable. Although he lacked freedom, he had risen to be the master's personal slave through his labor, and it was their arrival that disrupted his former life. After this incident, Spartacus realized that while he could liberate their bodies, freeing their minds from bondage was much more challenging. Spartacus temporarily halted his next plan of action, using the estate as a temporary headquarters and beginning to train the newly joined slaves. He gave them enough respect and trust to integrate into the group and experience the value of equality and freedom. A few days later, several torches appeared in the distance. A few fully armed Roman soldiers were approaching. Not knowing their intentions and to avoid unnecessary trouble, Spartacus entrusted Tiberius with enough faith to disguise himself as a slave and answer the door. Tiberius cleverly dispelled the visitors' suspicions with a few words. They were just on routine patrol. But as the soldiers were about to leave, Tiberius suddenly called out to them.
"You have come a fair distance from Capua. Come, and I will give you something to make effort worthwhile."
Those hiding inside the house quickly rushed out and savagely attacked the 6 soldiers. However, at that moment, Tiberius picked up a sword from the ground and charged at Spartacus.
Spartacus!
Crixus grabbed Tiberius by the neck, demanding to know why he had lured the soldiers inside. Tiberius explained that they had noticed his missing slave collar, and if he had let them go, they would have surely returned with more soldiers. It turned out they had misunderstood Tiberius. Spartacus was overjoyed, as this proved that slaves could indeed be transformed. But facing the relentless pursuit of Roman soldiers, where would their path lead them next? Do you feel a sense of déjà vu upon seeing this man covered in white paint? Indeed, this man is Enomaus, the trainer from the training grounds in Spartacus. Enomaus' combat prowess in his youth was second only to Theocles, but now, he has voluntarily come to the hellish underground fighting arena, solely wishing for death. It's undeniable that the slave master's brainwashing tactics are profoundly effective. Under Batiatus's long-term indoctrination, Enomaus' sense of belonging to the gladiatorial arena had become deeply ingrained. In Enomaus' view, the glory of a gladiator lies in dying in the arena. However, with the fall of the Batiatus family, Enomaus' dream of dedicating himself to the training grounds was shattered. Now branded as a rebel, he came to the underground arena in disguise, seeking to shed his blood on this land he so loved. Enomaus had fought in 8 battles, decapitating 10 men, and was now utterly exhausted. Knowing that Enomaus wants to die, the referee decides to grant him his wish. Yet, Enomaus was not favored by death. At the brink of death, a mysterious figure suddenly appeared, thrusting a sword through Enomaus' opponent's throat. On the other hand, since Spartacus' assassination attempt, Glaber had been harboring a grudge. Though he found Spartacus' previous hiding place, the rebels had moved by the time he arrived to besiege it. Glaber wants to intensify the search, but he doesn't have enough men, and he wants the support of the new local magistrate. However, the official's cousin was Glaber's archenemy with significant influence in the Senate. They too wished to capture Spartacus to claim credit, with interests clashing between the two parties. Collaboration between their armies seemed almost impossible. At this impasse, Lucretia walked in, suggesting they hold a sacrificial ceremony to listen to the divine omens and guide them. To everyone's surprise, Glaber believed in it. He immediately asked Aurelia to accompany Lucretia to the market to buy items for the sacrifice. As soon as they reached the market, a crowd surrounded Lucretia. Now, in the eyes of the public, Lucretia was akin to a deity. After all, having survived the massacre, many believers saw her as someone protected by the gods. Lucretia, pretending, blessed the people. Only Aurelia knew that this seemingly amnesiac person was possibly planning to rise again as a priestess under the guise of a prophetess. While Aurelia was distracted, a familiar figure suddenly appeared in the crowd. Upon seeing him, Lucretia's eyes widened in utter surprise. There was no extensive conversation between them. The person simply handed her a note and quickly left. Meanwhile, in an effort to capture Spartacus as soon as possible, Glaber finally agreed to meet with the official Spartacus to discuss a potential collaborative manhunt. However, Spartacus was extremely arrogant. He blamed Glaber for provoking Spartacus, leading to the current predicament. Spartacus deliberately inquired about who would command if they collaborated. Glaber, unwilling to compromise, stated that he must be the overall commander. As a partner, Spartacus would have to follow his arrangements, though he could share some of the glory afterward. Before Glaber could finish, Spartacus stood up from his seat. The two began a heated argument, with Spartacus uttering words Glaber least wanted to hear, labeling Glaber a weakling who rose to power through his father-in-law.
To me, in such manner again, and I will have your tongue.
Their collaboration completely fell through. Spartacus failed to notice the fiery rage in Glaber's eyes. Following the failed collaboration, Glaber could only place his hopes on Lucretia. Lucretia performed a sacrificial ritual in the hall. With Glaber and Aurelia watching, she slaughtered a sheep, but despite reciting incantations for a long time, Glaber saw no divine will, indicating the ritual's failure. Glaber saw this and decided to go back to rest. Aurelia, with a conflicted heart, knew this was the best time to eliminate Lucretia, thus burying her secrets forever. As Lucretia focused on her prayers, Aurelia quietly reached for a small knife. However, just as Aurelia was about to act, a slave rushed in urgently. Aurelia paused her actions. Glaber, annoyed by the late-night interruption, also came out, but upon seeing the person before him, his attitude changed 180 degrees.
Should set you up on path to the fall of Spartacus.
The gods truly heed my prayers.
The visitor was Ashur. Lucretia's eyes gleamed with satisfaction, clutching the note tightly. Only they knew the true story behind the apparent divine intervention. What Lucretia didn't know was that Ashur's purpose was not just to help her secure her position beside Glaber. It was not that simple.